In this episode we are going to start implementing add to cart functionality. I say start because this is a pretty big functionality, so I'm going to split it into two parts. In this first part we are going to create add to cart button, and instead of using something like Redux, we are actually going to try to use Directus and React Query for our state management. Directus is going to be used to persist the data in the user session collection that we are going to create. There we will temporarily save the user's order and persist the data that way. Let me show you what I mean. So I have this product right here, it's called Super Duper Hat, and what happens now if I choose the color and choose the size of that hat, if I click add to cart, as you can see I get the session ID, and we are saving that session ID to local storage, but also we are creating session on the Directus side. So if I go to my Directus and I'm currently in the session, if I refresh the page, as you can see we added this ID, which we are going to use to track the users through our site. And also, as you can see here, we have this temp order field, which has the product ID, price, quantity, color ID, size, and so on. Now, if I go to the front page and go to Very Good Mug, I click add to cart once again, choose a color, add to cart. Now, if I refresh this, you can see that now we have two products in here. So if I click on this, you can see that we have this temp order, which consists of product with the ID of 1 and product with the ID of 3. Now this session is a collection in Directus, and maybe later we will actually hide it because we don't want to click on it, we don't want to add anything to it. We want this collection to be filled out by our users simply by using our site. So this is what we are going to be doing in this episode, and then in the next episode we are going to finish this functionality by implementing a user cart and display the current order that way. Now the first thing we need to do, we need to create session collection. So I'm just going to click plus, going to call it session, and the primary ID is actually going to be generated UUID, and we are going to of course turn all of these fields on, save it, and now here we just want to create one single field, and that field is actually going to be this repeater field. We are going to call it temp order. So when the user comes to the page, he goes to the product, clicks on add to cart. So in here, in this temp order, we want to save all of the products that the user has clicked on add to cart. So we are calling it temp order, and now I'm just going to continue in the advanced mode. This is going to be type of JSON, so our data is going to be saved as JSON string. And for the interface, we need to create a few fields here that are going to be repeating, right? So we just click create new, and the first field is going to be product ID. It's going to be a string. The interface is going to be input, and that's it. We don't want to touch anything else, and all of the other fields are going to be just like this one. So the next one is going to be quantity. It's going to be a string, and the interface is going to be input. The next one is price, also string, also input. Save it, create new, color ID, string, input, save. And the last one is size ID, string, input, save. And that's it. So display is okay. We can just show the raw value. Conditions, we don't have any conditions, and that's it. Save it. Now as you can see, we can even hide this collection from our application. We are not going to be doing that right now because I want to show you how these sessions are coming into Directus, so I want to be able to see them. But For this, you can actually save them, actually hide them, because you don't want to touch them. So this session collection is only going to be filled in once the user clicks on add to cart, and you don't want to touch it manually from your administration. But if we go here, if we go to session, we don't have any sessions. We can maybe create a new session, and here if you click, so this is the way you would use the repeater field. You would add product ID, quantity, price, and so on. As I said, we are not going to be filling this out from the administration part. Also, let us not forget to go to roles and permissions and actually turn most of these on, because we want to be able to update the session, we want to be able to create the session, and later on we also want to be able to actually delete the session, or at least delete the part of the session. Okay, so we are going to turn all of these on. And that's it, I think, for the Directus part. Now let's go to our Nextjs and create, first of all, mutation that is going to help us to add new sessions to our database. So first of all, let's go to our queries here, and in here I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it sessions or session, whatever. So I'm just going to call it sessions.js, and in here we are going to add our queries and our mutations. So first of all, I'm going to create a mutation that is going to help us add a new session to our Directus administration or to our database. So I'm going to call it create session, and this one is going to be a mutation. So mutation, going to call it create session item. And in here, we are going to receive some data. So we need to receive data. Since we are creating session, we want to set the status of that session, which is going to be a mandatory field. So we are always going to be sending a draft. And also we want to fill out the temp order, right? So here I'm going to say data, and the type for that data is going to be called create session input. Create session input. And I'm adding this exclamation point because this is mandatory. So to create the session, you need to send some data in. And the actual function that is going to create that data is going to be called create session item. As you can see, since I'm using introspection and I'm using a plugin for GraphQL and PHP Storm, I get auto completions for this. And we are receiving data here. And we are actually returning, you can return some data. So once we create the data, we are going to get the response from the server. And in that response, I just want to return the ID, because we are going to be needing that ID to set it in our local storage. So once that ID is set, then the user is, you can think of it like the user is connected to our administration or to our backend, and now we can follow him throughout the process of buying something on our website through that ID. So we are going to be needing that ID, and that's why I'm defining it here. Okay, so let's just save this, and now we can go to Slack.js and actually create a session there. Now, first of all, I'm just going to go to helpers, and here we already have this fetch data.js. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it setData.js, and this one is actually very similar to fetch data, but it's just a little bit different, and I want to have a separate method for actually setting my data on the server. So fetch data is going to be used to get the data from the server, and set data, we are going to be using that one to actually send the data to the server and write it there. So when we are creating our session, we are going to be using this set data method. Okay. Now that we have this set up, we can actually start doing something in our Slack.js file. So first thing that actually I want to do is I just want to set the color ID and the size IDs like this. So we are going to use useState. I'm going to import it from React. We are going to use useState, and then here, so on our input fields here, and also down here, we are going to use this set color ID and says set size ID because we are going to be needing it later. So I'm just going to say here on change, and let me just make this a bit more readable. So on change, what we want to do, this is going to be an event, EFT, and here I just want to set the ID of the color. So set color ID is going to be eft.target.value. So this is going to be the value of this input field. Okay, so we do pretty much the same thing for the sizes. So here, making this also a bit more readable, just going to paste this in, and this is going to be called set size ID. Okay, and we are also sending the event.target.value, and that's about it. So this is the way that we are going to get our colors and our sizes. So how are we going to create a session, at least for the first time? So let's do it like this. First of all, we want to import a use query. We are going to be needing it later, so I'm importing it right now. And also we want to import use mutation from React Query. Okay, so we are going to be using this use mutation. And how do you use it? So I'm just going to add it right here. So you add const is mutation is going to be equal to use mutation, and then here we want to send the data. So I'm going to call our data new session, and then we want to use the function that we just created just a while ago. So we do import set data from helpers, and I'm going to use that method to send this mutation to the server. So I'm going to do set data, and first thing I need to send in this method is the actual mutation. So our mutation is called create session. It's going to be automatically imported from queries session. So create session, and also I need to send the data for that session. So I'm going to do it like this. I'm going to do data new session. Okay, so in this way we are actually now defining our mutation and sending the data to that mutation, and hopefully this will create the mutation. This will actually create the session on our Directus administration. And to do that, here I'm just going to create a button. I'm going to give it some classes so that it doesn't look hideous, and it's going to say on click mutation.mutate, and then status is draft. So this is the data that we are sending. As I said, we must send the status, but everything else is optional. So for now, I'm just going to send the status. I'm not going to send the temp order or nothing like that. And the button is says add to cart. So when somebody clicks it, it should trigger our mutation, and it's going to send this data to it. So let's see if this works. Save it, go to our browser, refresh this. If I go to super duper head, and now I can click add to cart. So something happened, but we still don't know what exactly, or if this even worked. So we can go to public, we can go to session and refresh it. And unfortunately, we don't have any data here. Okay, so for some reason, probably doing the auto completion, I set this to be set size ID instead of set data. Okay, so let's hope this works now as expected. Go to our browser, refresh this, and now if I click add to cart, I get GraphQL response. And now if I go to session, refresh it, as you can see, we added a session right here. I'm just going to make this to show our ID. ID is going to be the first field. We don't even need to show the status, and I'm going to make it a bit bigger like this. Later on we are going to get the temp orders here. Okay, so this is the way you would create your first session. So this is the way we are creating our session. Of course, we need to now implement some logic to actually add the order to that session. So let's do that right now. Now we want to add the actual order or temp order to our session when we are creating it. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, I'm just going to create a method and I'm going to call it add to cart. So this is going to be our method that is going to trigger once we click that add to cart button. And in here, I want to say mutation, just like we did at the button level, mutate. So we say mutation, mutate. And then here we want to send our data. So first of all, status is going to be draft. Okay. And then we need to send the temp order. Now, temp order is actually an array since we are using the repeater field, and also it's an array because our order can consist of multiple items, right? Multiple products. So we can't make this just to be a simple object. It needs to be an array, and in that array we are sending our first object, and in there we are just going to define the data that we need to send to the server for our order. So the first thing is product ID, and product ID is actually going to be the product.id that we are getting for our page, right? Because we are displaying the product on that page. Next thing, we want to send the price. So that is going to be product price. Okay. Next thing is quantity, and we are just going to set this to be 1. We are not going to be dealing with quantity just yet, and not in this episode. So for the color ID, we are going to send in color ID that we are defining right here with useState. So whenever somebody clicks on the color, this state is going to change and it's going to set the color ID that we need. And the same thing goes for the size ID. So size ID, color ID, quantity, price, and product ID. Great, save this. And now on our button, instead of doing this, we are just going to say add to cart. And that's it. Save it. And let's test this out now in our browser. So if I come here and I do color, I do size, I click add to cart, something did happen. So let's see if it happened. Okay, refresh this. And as you can see, now we have 2 sessions. This is our last session and it contains product ID, which is 1, the price, quantity, color ID is 1 also, and the size ID is 2. And if you click on it, you can actually see it like this. Great, so now we are actually sending our temp order there. But we have a problem here, right? We said that we are going to use this session ID, so this session ID, to actually track our users through our applications. But currently that is not happening because whenever you click add to cart, so I can click it a few times, I will just get different session IDs with this. So this is not going to be helping us very much. So what we need to do now is we actually need to persist at least this ID on the front-end side or in our application. And then we are going to tell our application, okay, so if this ID already exists, then please don't create anything, then just update this order. Don't create a new session, because this ID should be unique to the user at least for a while until its local storage is cleared out. Okay, so now here I'm going to add this. So we are defining another state which we are calling is session set. So we want to check if we have a session ID in our local storage, and to do that I'm using useState. And first of all, I'm checking if this is a window, so if we are doing something in the browser, because if you are doing something on the server you don't have local storage there. And then we are checking if the local storage get item session ID exists. So if this is false, then our session is currently not set. So we can use this flag to create our mutation a bit differently. So here I'm going to say something like this. So I'm going to say if is session set, but we want to check actually if session is not set. So if session is not set, then we of course want to set the data and create the session. But also what we want to do, we want to wait for the response. Remember when we were creating this query or this mutation right here, we set this ID. And when we create the session, we are going to get the ID back and we need that ID. So here we say then and we wait for the response. And once the response comes in, and what we want to do is we want to say local storage, set item. The item is going to be called session ID. And we want to set the response create session item dot ID. So if you take a look at our query, so this is called create session item, and in it we are going to get the ID. So we are setting this ID in our local storage so that we can track our users by it. And the last thing we want to do here is, so when all of this is done, when we get the data, when we get that response, when we save our session, we also want to set this flag, so this state set session to be true. And now save this. So now if we go to our browser, refresh this page, and I click add to cart, GraphQL did something. If we check the application tab, we can see that we have this session ID here, and if we go to sessions and refresh it, that ID is still here, so 124. But now if I click this again and again and again and again and again, if we go here, nothing happens and nothing is saved, and we are not creating any more sessions. Okay, so that's great. But of course we still have ways to go, because we are not creating any more sessions, but we are also not adding anything new to the cart. So if I click here and click add to cart, nothing is going to change. The product ID is always going to be 1 and so on. So we have some more coding to do to make this functionality work as expected. Now what we want to happen is, so we are not going to set new sessions here, but what we want to do is actually update the session with the new data. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to create a new query, and this query is going to update our data. It's not going to set new data, but it's going to update that data. And I'm going to call this one update session. This is also going to be a mutation. I'm going to call it update session item. This one is receiving data, and that data has a type of update session input. It's also required. And also we need to send the ID of the session, because we need to let Directus know which session do we want to update. Because remember, on your web shop, in a real situation, there might be multiple users at one time in your shop. So you need to send the ID of the session for your specific user that you want to update. Okay, and that ID is also mandatory. And now the function for actually updating our sessions is called update session item. And of course it receives the data and it receives the ID. And also you just need to send, you just need to define something for response. I'm just going to set this to be ID again. So as you can see, this is very similar to our mutation for creating session, except for this one, we also need to send the ID of the session so that we can update it. And that should be it. So now we have this update session method. So here now we can say else. So if the session is not set, we want to create a new session and then set the ID of that session into our local storage and set this set session flag to be true. But if our session is already set, then we want to do something else. Then we want to update that session. And how do we do that? We just do set data again, and then we do update session. We need to send the data in which is going to be a new session. So this data right here. And we also need to send the ID, and we can get that ID from our local storage. Get item session ID. Okay, so let's see what is going to be happening now. This is still not done. We still have some work to do, but we are getting closer. Okay, currently we have this session ID, so we shouldn't be able to create new sessions in our administration, since this is saved in our local storage. So now if I click on M, let's just actually check our session right now. Let me refresh this page. Let's check it. So the product ID is 1, the price is $19.99. So please remember that. So I'm going to set this to be M and click add to cart. Okay, so let's see if anything changed here. Okay, so as you can see, product ID now is 2 and price is $29.99. Okay, so you already see the problem here. So if I go to super duper head, check this, add to cart, refresh it. Now the product ID is 1, the price is $19.99, and so on. So the problem here now is that actually we are not adding anything to our temp order, we are just replacing the data there. So we need to handle that also. We will need to get this and then fill it in with new data or add new objects to this array. Okay, so first thing that we need to do to fix this problem is we need to go to sessions and create another query. And I'm just going to paste this one in because it's super simple. So this one is going to be called get session, and it's going to be a query, not a mutation this time. And we are getting the session by ID, and we are getting from it the ID and the temp order. We need that temp order so that we can actually push the data in it and not just replace the data from it. Okay, so let's save this. Great. Next thing we need to do is now we need to get that data somehow. So of course, to do that, we are just going to be using use query. So I'm going to call my data session. I'm also getting this is success variable. Then we are going to use query or use query. We're going to call this query session. I'm adding it a name because I want to show you how this looks when you take a look at it with React Query DevTools. Then we do async. We await for get data and we send in get session query. Get session. The response is going to be called session by ID. And of course, we need to send the ID of that data. So ID is going to be local storage, get item, and session ID. Now, there is one more thing to do here. That is, I'm going to open up this object and set enabled here. And that enabled flag is going to depend on is session set. Because we don't want to get this data if the session doesn't exist, right? Because then this data doesn't exist and we can run into problems. So in React Query, what you can do is you can just pass in this enabled and make this use query dependent on something, on some other data. So in this case, we are saying to Nextjs or to use query, okay, so if the session is set, only then get me the data for that session, right? So if I save this, and we can take a look at it by using React Query DevTools. So open up your app.js file, import React Query DevTools, and then just set this here. So React Query DevTools initially is open is going to be false. Save this, and if we go to our browser, now we have this icon right here, and these are React Query DevTools. So let's refresh this page. And as you can see, the session is currently working. We are getting the data for the sessions. But if I remove this session ID from here, so from our application, we are removing it from local storage. If I remove it, now if I refresh the page, as you can see, it says disabled. So we are not getting this session right now. We are waiting for local storage to fill up with session ID so that we can get the session that we need, and then we can update it with the data that we need. So now let's create one more state. And that state is going to be called temp order and set temp order. And we are checking if the session, if we even have the session, and then we are checking the temp order in it. So the data that we are getting from the server, from our session, it's called temp order. If we are not getting that, or if local storage is not set to session ID, we just want to pass in an empty array. Now, on our add to cart, we are going to also change this a little bit. So here, I'm just going to say let temp order be temp order. Okay, so this is either going to be an empty array or it's going to be an array filled with the data that we are getting from our session. And then I just want to do something like this. So temp order push. So whenever somebody clicks on add to cart, we are going to push this to this array, to temp order array. We are going to push this data in. And then here, instead of doing this, mutate, I'm just going to delete everything. So this is going to be our temp order that is going to be passed down here. Right? So hopefully this, I think, maybe should work now. Let us check. So first of all, let's just go to our administration, refresh this. Let me see if there are any more sessions. Delete all the sessions from here. We are going to go here, so we don't have set anything in our local storage. So let's pretend we are a user. And I'm coming to this page, I click on this, I click on this, click add to cart, great. Now let's go to original t-shirt and I'm going to set this, great. And then let's go to very good mug, choose something, add to cart, great. Hopefully something happened. So of course session ID is set, so at least that works. And then if we refresh this, now as you can see, we are getting something else. So we are getting product ID of 1, but also some other product. And we actually have 3 products in our temp order array, right? So this works, great. So this is the way we would fill our temp order with data. And now in the next episode, we are going to use that data to create user's cart right here, in which we are going to display the current status of the user's order. And then later on, we are going to create the order page where a user can interact with that order and so on. But for now, this is going to be enough for us. There's just one simple thing that I want to do, and that we are going to change in the next episode. But here, I just want to do something like this. So if we go to our code editor, I'm going to set another state here. And that state is going to be called button disabled and set button disabled. And then we want to go to our button down here. And I'm going to say that disabled. So when the button is disabled, it's going to have some grayish background. And we need to set, okay, so I'm just going to set this class name and I'll click down here. And also we need to set the disabled prop. And the disabled prop is going to be button disabled. Button disabled. Save this. And what I want to do next is when somebody clicks on add to cart, so we want to allow the users to only be able to click on that product once. So here, once everything is finished with our mutations and our queries, we do set button disabled to be true. Okay, so now if I refresh this and I choose something like this and click add to cart, now I can't click on that button anymore. But of course, as I said, we are going to fix this even better in the next episode, because of course, if I refresh this page, then I can again click on it, but I don't want the users to be able to do that. So we are going to need to interact with our session, see what products are in, and if the products that are currently in our temporary order or our temp order, then we don't want the users to be able to add that product to the cart. Okay, so that's it for this episode. As I said, in the next episode we are going to continue with this functionality, and we are going to create the user's cart and actually show the users which products they have chosen and which products they are intending to buy. So anyway, remember, everything we did here will be available for you on GitHub. The link will be in the description below. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.